Okay. Welcome everybody to the RMIT's Workforce Innovation and Development Institute's final Fireside Chat for 2021. I think it's interesting to be coming to the end of 2021 in a very different way than we ended 2020, which will be part of the conversation with the fabulous Dr. Fiona Kerr today. I want to start the session by acknowledging that we are meeting on Aboriginal lands and pay my very deep respects to our First Nations people. Acknowledge that the lands that we are on were never ceded and have been very well cared for many generations by our First Nations people, and that we have a great deal to learn from them and reparation work to do. I want to introduce you to a very dear friend and colleague, Dr. Fiona Kerr, who I met at a Compassion Revolution conference, I think a bit over 2 years ago, Fiona. And yeah, we both ran a session and were inspired and energized by listening to each other, and then ever since have had a number of very long, very energizing conversations. Fiona is one of the smartest, most humble, knowledgeable people I know, and brings what is incredibly impressive is brings together knowledge from a range of disciplines that don't normally come together. So engineering, leadership, social sciences, she is the founder of the Neurotech Centre, which was in the invitation to this session, but we will send you out some resources with some of the really great work that Fiona's done after this session. So welcome, Fiona. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Fiona, the conversation that we thought would be really interesting for the audience today is one that I know you've been having with a lot of groups. It's on a lot of people's minds. Why are we feeling the way we're feeling? What's happened in the way that we interact in our brain chemistry across the last 2 years? A lot of the people in the audience for this group will have experienced the longest lockdown in the world. That was a bit of a depressing day when we reached that mark. The impact of and what we've talked about, the impact of the level of uncertainty and anxiety, and the level of that is unprecedented for any of us in our lifetimes, and certainly not something I'm built for. And all of the complexity of the way that our ways of relating and working have changed so dramatically. So anxiety and uncertainty, and then thinking about, and what, I know you've done some very deep thinking about the importance of trust and safety. So how do we finish this year? How do we think about why we're feeling the way we are now, and understand what's happening in the teams that we are part of, that we are leading, and thinking about how do we move into next year, which will be hybrid working is business as usual. This is the way things are, really, and how do we do that well? So if I can get you started by talking to us a bit about, why do we feel the way that we do? What's going on?
Right, and there's so many things that we're coping with sort of some of which you've listed. I guess the interesting thing for me is that people are actually built to have a level of anxiety whenever there is change. And that's actually a normal thing because our brain is lazy. We're cognitive sloths. So the brain, that's why we have habits. The brain really likes to have a set way of doing things. But at the same time, because we have to rewire when we have new things to deal with, that automatically gives you a bit of energy, if you like, that anxiety. But that's if it's in a positive environment. But when it's in a negative environment, then that often turns to fear, stress, those very different things, which then set up kind of stress brain loops that make us, you know, tired and cognitively fatigued. So we've got a number of things happening that are over and above, I guess, the normal change fatigue that you get in life, in normal environments. So change fatigue at the moment is around, mainly around the lack of knowledge about what's happening. So it's the unpredictability, because each time we think we've got a handle on what's going on, it changes. And so that constant unpredictability means that we're also going to feel a lack of a locus of control. So humans have this really strong need for an internal locus of control. And it's what makes us do, you know, be really stubborn and do things even we don't want to do if someone else has told us to do something else. And it's a neurophysiological drive. And so when you have that really strong locus of control being taken away from you, humans don't deal with it very well either. So we have that kind of change fatigue. We've also got many different areas to do with cognitive fatigue. So we have the unpredictability. We also have, I guess, the complexity of what's going on at the moment, because it isn't just one thing changing for a lot of people, it's everything changing. It's how they live, how they work, whether they can afford their house, and you know, how their children get educated. It's just everything. And the people in the front line, so I deal with first responders and people who, you know, they've also got that massive added stress of trying to make the best of an environment which is constantly changing and often not resourced or recognised or supported. So that's very difficult as well. You've also got boundary blur. So suddenly, for many people again, it's quite difficult in the situation of trying to do everything, say, from home, you know, working from home, schooling from home, living from home, cutting off. And we are one of those countries that has not been good for a number of years in bounding things like work and you know, home life. And interestingly, those countries that were already very good at that, you know, we all know the Scandinavian countries are very good at saying you go home at 5, you need, or 6, you need home time and friend time and work time, whereas we were already pretty messy there. And so the countries that were messy are now dealing with that massive fatigue, whereas the countries that were very definite about it are faring a bit better. So all of those things stress. Then you've got the whole thing on top of you, which is the virtual technology fatigue. So that's a number of things. It's not just Zoom fatigue, which is actually about the fact that there's loads of things our brains can't pick up over a screen. So as an engineer and neuroscientist as well, we do a lot of looking at what turns on. So some parts of your brain turn on all the time when you're on a screen, because it's constantly looking for information that we actually can't get over a screen, but it's still looking. So those micro behaviours, all those things that's trying to pick up, so it's exhausted. Other parts of your brain never turn off. So, just don't turn on in the first place. So there's various areas around that sort of socio-emotional empathic kind of interaction we get that don't work over screens the same as they work face to face, and we'll talk about that. So we've got those kind of things. We've got, I guess, the virtual fatigue about ourselves. We've talked a little bit about bounding and connection and juggling those things. We've also got things around managing it. So one of the interesting things about us is when we are tired, we also have less willpower, which means we also just go for a distraction, and we have technology built beautifully to do that. Unfortunately, though, when we're on it, we get more cognitively fatigued, but we get less willpower. So it's that terrible cycle of, you know, either you game all night or you buy rubbish on eBay or you do those kind of things. And putting into that, very many people now have to be glued to their technology to do their work and to also connect with their friends and loved ones. So you've got this kind of, I guess, confusing, complex love-hate relationship with that, with the technology that you're trying to manage. Then we've got isolation. So we are built to connect, And when we don't isolate very much, when we don't connect very much, when we are isolated, especially for people living on their own and working on their own, if they're locked down, then we don't get so many of those things you get with human connection and proximity. And in actual lockdown, especially if you're on your own, you're actually mimicking what depression does. So two of the main things you get when you have rising depression is you don't mix and you don't exercise and move around. And so you're basically telling the brain and the body that you're depressed. But that lack of interaction and proximity, I spend a lot of time talking about that, especially now, but we always have, because it is really critical. So we are this beautiful electrochemical bag, and we are made for connecting. And so we get to measure things like the interbrain synchrony. Yes, there really is brain Wi-Fi when you're together, and it turns on all sorts of neurons and chemicals and direct eye gaze. All of those things really boost our oxytocin and serotonin and dopamine, and they give us stimulation in our brains. In fact, the more you have interbrain synchronization and stimulation, the more you have intrabrain synchronization. So it actually changes your own brain and how much that's, whizzing around, connecting and working and firing as well. So how excited it is. And you have voice, which is beautiful in terms of when you hear a live human voice, we connect to it in very different ways than we do when it's not live. And so we have a certain synchronization to do with the actual sort of voice waves that we pick up. And in fact, it's 2 to 8 hertz, and we've always got a part of the brain that's resonating at that level, waiting for another human voice. And if I know you, like say we do, whenever I hear your voice, off go my socio-emotional areas, firing and all positive. And there's a lot around that we can talk about, even things like why you should talk about bad news over a phone rather than a screen. Why, if you want to be creative with someone else, pick the phone up, because it allows the brain to dance and play and create rather than trying to look at a screen. It's a really lovely, complicated area. But a big thing that's come up more and more over the last few years is chemo signaling. So when we're in proximity with another human, we give off and absorb from each other at least 2,000 chemicals we already know of. And they change emotional aspects, they change how well we feel. So that radar that we talk about, we're absolutely right. We're not only picking up the electrochemical sort of systems when we interact with people, but we're also chemically changing each other, how we feel, how we're thinking, and that doesn't happen over screens. So we're starved of that. And those people who have their sort of friends and family and children at home are in a lot better position that way. But those people who don't, or are in a home situation that's not forgiving or supportive, or those kind of, then they can't get away from it either. So you can have negative chemo signaling. So there's just so many things going on, and so many of them are around the situation that we have right now.
So Fiona, there's about a dozen questions I've got to follow up on all of those things, and I'm sure there are from people in the audience. This is being recorded. You will, like me, get to listen to it again because there's a lot of information in there. There's one thing though, given that what we talked about we're moving this hybrid environment we're moving into. So people are thinking about, and I know from my team, there are some people who are very ambivalent about coming back into the office, and I can do it all from home now. And so thinking about what the rules or the guidelines or the approach are to hybrid working. When do you go in? Why do you go in? What's the things that you need to be in for? There's clearly lots of implications in what you're talking about that. So talk to us a bit about what your thoughts are about that.
Oh, it's fascinating because I work with organisations that range from they had to kick people out because they did not want to, they had to come in, still work well. And also the thing to think about is we're talking about less than 50% of jobs which can actually be done from home. So those jobs that can be done from home, still rarely are you know, perfect doing from home. So there's the actual job, there's how much that lends itself towards that analytical, codifiable output, which is what is technology is really good for. But apart from that, you've got various other reasons, I guess, for coming in, and organisations seem to stretch from, okay, we're going to go community, the Atlassian model of completely virtual, and I think they talk about meeting 4 times a year, right through to organisations that want people in all the time, but for the wrong reasons. You know, they want them in because they don't trust that they're going to do any work at home. Yeah. And in between, you've got most organisations trying to work out what is the best way forward now for us and for the staff that we've got, so that we can remain bonded, we can be in teams that have what they need, they can get on with being productive, and we can end up with, you know, people that have enough choice that we can choose when people do the work at home that you know is suitable for that, but then they can come in, not just for the let's go and have sort of a lovely coffee creativity day once a week on couches. That's fine, but it's very oversimplistic. So why do we need to come in? One of the fascinating things that Neurotech's been able to do for the last 2 years is have a look at what we do differently work-wise when you have other people within proximity within your team. So, and also how often you have to be with your team to maintain trust and alignment. Because one of the things that we've known for about 15 years is virtual teams do suffer from a lack of trust and alignment, because it's much more brittle if you just have a virtual system, and that's partly for the reasons we've just talked about. So the sort of things to work out are which jobs work well, split which ways, if you like. So which part of the job is best done, you know, in a team, and that is very often the creative aspect, and the part that's the kind of deep dive, complex thinking about how to do something together, and also the straight bonding, spending time together, ensuring that all of those beautiful little micro behaviors and those small actions and those things that you just cannot get, you know, none of that serendipitous kind of, you know, coffee kind of discussion or interaction. Yes, we've all had the Zoom cocktails and and that kind of stuff, but it's not the same, because what you get over a screen is part of the exhaustion is, as I said, the body trying to fill in all of the gaps, because it's a fairly frugal way of being able to interact. Whereas as soon as you're in the same space, you have thousands of pieces of communication, you know, thousands of ways of picking up and connecting. So thinking about going back, the organisations that work really well are those that make it really plain that we're going back to people. You know, we're not necessarily going back to the desk or the office where you can be checked on. We're actually going back to people. And when you are at home, what they are good at is not saying we'll pick up the latest technology and put it in so that you know, well, they say very often they start with saying so that you've got really good tools to do team work, but too often, because of the way that just technology is designed, because AI is very much a codifiable process, so really it picks up things that are easy to codify, like clicks and that kind of stuff. We don't have really good ways of measuring that kind of informal effort and productivity, and so if you've got an organisation that has a high level of trust in the first place and doesn't kind of monitor and move towards surveillance, and then they are then working out how you get people back in so that they can be together when they need to be, then you've got a much better, I guess, chance of people working well. So we look at what do you do in terms of how you change your processes and your methods for getting people in? How do you make sure that it isn't so free and easy that what I'm getting now is people saying, well, I'll come into work and no one else is there because there's no coordination around who should be where, you know, and how often do we need to be? Is it 3 days a week? Is it same 3 days a week? Is it from 9 till 2? Is it from 10 till, you know, what is it? And the best thing is you work it out. One of the things I think to remember is right from when COVID started, even a few months later, I was working with a New York company who were very edgy, very fast, young, all on one floor of a New York building, and you know, loved their job, had to go into lockdown. And when the head then sent out a survey saying, right, you know, do you want to come back to work? She was devastated because she said they've said no. And, you know, how could that be? Like they were just so close and they work off each other so well. And I said, right, send out another survey saying, do they want to work from home from now on? And they said no. So it's not that they didn't want to be at work, but at the time, if you like, the cognitive dissonance of having to come back to the reality of this changed in-their-face COVID world with masks and shields and only 30% in the office, and that's what they didn't want. They didn't want to step into that. So very often when you talk to people about what do you want your hybrid system to be, it's not so much about not wanting to be with other people in an office. It's about that natural anxiety around being plonked right in the middle of a changed world. And so, yeah, it's a very different environment. So the ones that talk about it, the ones that talk to their staff, the ones that have high levels of kind of open communication and kindness and respect are the ones that get really good agreement around when should we be in, what will suit it, who needs more support than others. So some people like to be in all the time, others work really well at home. So how do you get compromises on that? So open, honest conversations with a high level of trust around how do we do our work really well now, and then what kind of technology or other tools might support us, rather than let's buy the latest, you know, tool and turn everything on. And so, yeah, those are some of the things that are important.
Fiona, one of the earlier conversations, I think we did almost exactly the same thing at the beginning of the year or the end of last year, talking about hybrid working and how do you make it work, and was the same sort of things that you're talking about. It was at one of the organisations talked about, and they talked about the 3 C's. They talked about in terms of the reasons for coming back, which was a helpful kind of tool. It was connection, collaboration, and concentration. Yep. Because your point about we've got a team member who has to do some writing, who has a small child who often comes into the room and is crying. So going into the office is not necessarily about connecting with people sometimes. It's about having, as you said before, not everybody's space at home is different, and not making assumptions about what people's environment is at home is about, and asking some questions about what will work. But I think there's a question in the chat about what do you do when your manager says, right, it's really efficient having meetings online now, you know, so all of our meetings are going to be online now. And I've had conversations with other people. So this is very live. Everyone is having these conversations, and there are people at polar ends and there are people in the middle trying to work out where they fit. But I can, you know, we've done it now. We've done it for nearly 2 years. I can do my job from home, and it is more efficient if you're not someone who's picked up on all of what you're missing when you're not in the room. So you've kind of already answered this a bit about it's really having the conversation. But if you've got staff who are adamant they don't want to come back and I can do it from home and you've let me do it from home, or if you've got a manager who's saying it's more efficient doing it all online, let's just do it all online, what's some tips about how do you have that conversation?
Yeah, and if I can just go back to the 3 C's, the other part of that is actually control, and because yes, it's often much easier to control your environment at work, which we knew pre-COVID, you know, especially those who have small children or had small children that went back. So yes, and I certainly have those conversations around. You have managers that. Well, so let's start at management style, because that's one of the places I start with those people. So when I have a range of the managers in the organisation, and some are saying, thank God we can go back to being in the one room, and the others are saying, thank God we've got this method now where we never have to meet again. The conversations are around, right, let's have a look at the science and the data, because we've got 20 years of virtual management data. It's not just COVID that's created that. That's why Neurotech's around. It's been a problem for, well, it's been a challenge and a godsend. I mean, we couldn't do this if we didn't have technology. No. So certainly as an engineer, I love technology. The thing is, we have to make sure that we use it as an enabler. And when we do, it's amazingly good. When we misunderstand its shortcomings, then that's when we get that slow but sure rot in a lot of the quality aspects of human living and working together. So what I tend to do is then talk about who are the most successful leadership types across in teams, and especially using technology. So interestingly, those virtual leaders that have always worked well in terms of maintaining high trust, high alignment, high levels of collaboration are much more the charismatic leader who is more engaging, more interested in other people, their team, and who will naturally, if they possibly can, they'll go and actually spend time with them. But they're skilled, I guess, and also interested in making sure that there's a connection and a valuing of those people outside the straight work kind of resource requirements. And that's always been the case. Then there's very robust science around long and mid-term productivity styles that you get with just virtual. And again, because of the things that virtual interaction is useful for and virtual tools do well, certain aspects of productivity are fine, but they tend to be transactional, and that's a constant complaint in the last, especially in the last year. After the first year, there's an obvious swing towards, well, transactionally we get things done, but the capacity to look at the bigger picture, the strategy, the more creative aspects, those kind of aspects, they don't work nearly so well the way that we can interact over screens. And so that's another aspect. You get that slippage towards transactionalization. Hybrid is also messy in terms of things like presenteeism. So that is the old problem that we've always had in the workplace, and in fact we always have everywhere, of those people who are physically present for all those reasons we've talked about, because you've got that lovely electrochemical interaction, you've got the chemo signaling connection. That's a big part of why we talk about out of sight, out of mind. You know, as humans we know that, but it's true. And so as much as we can try and ensure that if we have hybrid teams, there is going to be no presenteeism, there is going to be no lack of or no, let's see, if you're not there, it's not going to be that you are disadvantaged. We are naturally, as human beings, disadvantaged. It's very difficult not to be. So there's a number of things that, with the best will in the world, are really difficult because of how humans work. But if you, and there's really interesting science around things like if you have a manager who onboards somebody face to face right at the beginning, even if it's just the very first time, then what you can see over time, and there's been studies out for a number of years, is when that person will then interact differently. Because again, what you get when you look at face to face is you actually get a neurophysiological change in terms of the wiring with that person. It's almost like, you know, creating a little nub of that person, and you get a difference in a number of aspects of how people work. And one of them is if you have people certainly meet their manager, meet the team, and then they can, even if they have to then work virtually for a while, when it comes to things like collaboration versus competition over tasks that might come up, those teams and those people that have never met veer statistically more towards competition, whereas the ones that have met will veer more towards collaboration. And it's just, there's just lots and lots of really interesting science. And I guess that's what we do, is we start to talk about, all right, let's have a look at what works and how long it's worked for, what we already know, what we've known before COVID, what the shortcomings that we still know technology has in terms of being able to, you know, create and collaborate and those kind of things, communicate. And then we'll look at topping that up. And so then we get the best of both worlds. And that's what it always should be. It's not that everyone has to be in the office every day, all the time.
Yep.
We won't go back to not wanting flexibility. Flexibility is a really good thing.
Yeah.
And what we find is with these discussions about, well, you and I have talked about the kind of the Great Resignation. Often people want to talk about that, which is quite a different thing in Australia than it is in, say, America. And then we've got other countries where we already had high levels of support and trust in, well, in governments, in processes, in media, in then feeling safe and secure. So I work in Finland. I did, hopefully will again, and yeah, very different environment there for feeling, I guess, safe and secure. And so their environment is really different in terms of things like how mobile people want to be, how much churn they've got, whether people are going to resign. Whereas a country like the US, which was coming off a really low base of low paid, not very good conditions, suddenly have many more jobs than people. So they're in a very different position right now. They have a very big, you know, resignation or churn factor. But what you see even there is if the organisations show that they will give flexibility, they'll give support, they'll still trust their people, so they won't use lots of technological surveillance and tools in the wrong ways, and that they use praise, recognition, they still listen, those people don't move.
Talk to me. You've mentioned the importance of trust a couple of times, and I'm curious about the place of trust, what it is, how you build it, how do you hold on to it, what are the factors that lead to, so why is it as important as, you know, you keep mentioning, and how do you build and maintain that? I think I listened to one of, and we'll put the recording, attach some stuff when we send the newsletter out, because I think people will want to know some of the resources, just to finish up the last bit of the conversation about where the evidence and the data is about what happens when you're face to face. So we might get some resources off you and links, Fiona, and we'll put that in the next newsletter. But trust, and that was what I was saying, one of the interviews I heard you do with someone about leadership, about the critical importance of trust, and how do you build it in this environment? Talk to us a bit about trust. Okay,
so there's a beautiful saying, which is to move at the speed of trust, and the reason, and it's almost like exponential, if you like, which is actually what change, successful change is exponential as well in the way that it moves. Trust is wonderful in that trust buffers risk. So when we feel that we're in a risky situation, as we all do now so often, with all those things to do with what we talked about, with that amount of sort of change and cognitive and virtual fatigue, when you feel that you can trust the people that are in your life, or that the people that support the environment that you're in, then your cognitive dissonance and your level of anxiety is a lot lower. So trust is a really interesting thing in that I looked at trust. So I do work around maintaining and building trust in cities and in countries and environments for a number of things. It's not just the sort of happiness quotient in countries, although that's really important. But the work, so a lot of the work in Finland is around how you gain a successful society. And that works at an individual level, it works at a family level, it works at a community level, and of course it works at a national level. And different countries have different levels of trust. So it's not, you know, we lament nowadays that no one trusts anyone anymore. We don't trust our politicians, we don't trust our media, we don't trust government. So, you know, why bother? Because they can all be as bad as each other. But it's not true. Some really are better than others, and some environments promote much higher trust than others. And so as a rule, what you see at a really big picture is once you lose trust in, very often it's once you lose trust in your government, and then you lose trust in your processes and your media and the information that you're getting, if you like, about your environment. The next step is to start losing trust in each other. And that's when we feel very unsafe in our environment. And that scaffold that's supposed to hold us and make us feel supported in our life and our society that we're living in disappears. And that can be awful. So what's the opposite of that? The opposite is feeling like you are safe, even though change is an obvious thing that's going to happen. And so that means very basic things like knowing that people care about your livelihood and what's going to happen to yourself and your children, whoever it is that you're looking after. So what keeps you up at night is a very particular thing that high trust environments will ask you. And they will then try and take away those things which make you feel makes you feel anxious, make you feel you have something to worry about. So I love the difference between the environments where people understand that, and very often they're very low key, but what they understand is it's not necessarily the job of an organization or a government to make you feel so, high trust and happy. But what it is their job to ensure that you don't feel that you are at risk and that you don't feel that you have something to worry about. So that Finnish high, they won the happiness quotient for about, I think, the third or fourth year now in the world. And they're very quiet about it. They say, well, it's not that we're happy, we are content. And the government there and many of the companies you work for there, they don't consider that it's their role to make us feel content. They consider it's their role to take away those things which might make us feel discontent and worried. So certainly in COVID environment, that means that their overarching role is written as efficient compassion, and they will ensure that people know that they'll have a roof over their heads, they'll be able to pay for their food, they'll have good education for their children, they'll still have good health, and none of those things will be risked by the situation. Whereas, well, we don't have that, and other countries are quite sort of different and go from one scale to the other. So that's at a really big level, which does make a difference. Our social capital is really critical to making people feel safe in a COVID world. Individually, if you have an organisation that makes it obvious that they'll do their best, if you like, and that we'll work this out together, and that as the next thing rolls in, we'll figure out how to make the best of that and how to work well. But what we'll do is make sure that we are still safe and supportive around each other. Then that level of trust will get you through anything, because what happens then in the brain of the individual is you turn on very different parts, if you like, of the brain, and neurophysiologically you have different neurochemicals happening. Your neurobiology changes. You have a higher level of things like empathy, load sharing. You have a higher level of resilience. You have even a better immune system, so your whole immunology is supported. You have calmer nervous system activity. You have higher things like dopamine and oxytocin. So you are much more resistant physiologically as well as emotionally to what's going to come your way, because you feel like you're going to be supported. And the opposite, I guess, is things like saying, well, yes, we're in it together, but then we're not, depending on who you are and what area you're in. And for a little while we'll put in money to save people, but then we know we'll take it away again. And if it hasn't worked, then those people left, well, that's up to them. And it's a very different message, if you like, to give people. And so trust is really critical, because if you don't have trust, then up goes all of that anxious activity around trying to ensure that the very basics of surviving securely are met, and that's where people's minds and hearts go. I think that one of the things that's important is to think about, I guess, resilience and support, and that's at your individual level. It's at your family level, it's at the workplace level, and it's if you're actually managing people or leading a team, it's that as well. It's been very interesting listening to people who have had that, what some people are calling COVID epiphany as well, because we've got, as part of the complexity, we've got a number of things happening. So for some people, being in isolation has been a really difficult situation. For others, it's been a chance to think about what's important and to reconnect with family and nature and their environment, their local environment, and with friends, and to really rethink what they want to do or how they want to do it. And with some organisations, they've really found the way that people rally and work is quite different to what they expected. So they're changing what they realise is important to the people that work for them. And so what I'm really, I guess, hoping is that we don't forget the lessons, because again, working in different places and still being connected to them, what's really interesting is some people and some organisations and some countries are much better than others at saying, well, what have we learned and what do we want to gain from this, and what have we also realised doesn't work as well, and how do we top that up and tackle it? So if it's you yourself, because something like this will tend to show the cracks in anything. So when you get a large change like COVID, then what it does is it amplifies those things that work well and those things that don't work well. And if you've already got, say, a high trust, supportive environment, then you'll tend to find that will work well in the environment you're in the situation you're in. But if you have things that are already an issue, then very often they will be multiplied and amplified negatively. So having a chance to be able to reflect and say, okay, so what are the things that I've learned are really important to me now, and how can I maintain them? And what are the things that I've learned are working even more negatively, if you like, and how can I change that? Is a really critical aspect of not only thinking about yourself, but also thinking about what you'll do with your family and in your, your workplace, various aspects.
Fiona, you talked about the what we've all seen about the big resignation and the differences in the way that's playing out here and it's playing out in other countries, and and the impact of the difference of the way countries were operating and organisations going in, and the impact that's had. What are some of the other themes that you're seeing in Australia? What are some of the other things that you would think we need to be thinking about in the way we plan for the way we work together going into next year?
Right. And I think we do need to plan to work together. And so some of the trends I'm seeing are organisations that are realising that they really have to do it because, to be brutal, governments are not good at it. So that's an aspect that's really interesting. So thinking about how they will interact with people that work for them and ensure that they know that they're, I guess, that, there's a base of being cared for and being valued, is a really interesting positive that I've seen in some places that work very well, because then really you can have the conversations. We don't have all the answers right now, so we're about to do a long project with actually Victorian government, with a part of the Victorian government, and it's all about the best of both worlds. It's how do we now design the hybrid world. So we know some things that we've been talking about today, but there are going to be other things that are rising over time, and it's much more important to have that open, collaborative communication and high trust. And if you've got that, then people will step into that kind of unknown new. There's a lovely term in systems. It's the space of possibilities, would you believe it's called? It's the next adjacent, which just means that that's the way we always go into change. It's that next step into something we don't quite know, and then the next step into something we don't quite know. But if we feel supported, and we can say this works well or this isn't working, and then you can tweak, because that's adaptation, is constant tweaking. By getting feedback, listening, working together, then those places aren't nearly as high stress and negative. And it doesn't take more work, it just takes different work, because it actually takes a lot of work if you're a lazy organisation that just says, that's great, slap it all online, it's going to work. Because then in not monitoring those things that don't go as well, they eventually start to bubble, rise, and really, really put you off balance. So it's much better, if you like, to be in tune and to do it together going forward. So at an organisational level, those organisations that want to have that, want to do that, are already faring much, much better than the ones that don't want to. And I think individually, as we were just talking about as well, it's really interesting the role that technology is playing, and that's probably another conversation altogether, because it is, we haven't tackled that whole side of what it is built to do, which is absolutely to be really, really sticky. And billions have been made through COVID around that. And so again, working with families and technology, that's been a very interesting aspect in terms of having those technology breaks and having that downtime from the need to be on screen all the time, because kids have to be on screen all the time, teachers have to be on screen all the time, parents have to be on screen all the time. So those open conversations about that not being your go-to for the downtime, and what else you might do. I've got lovely stories from people that have rediscovered each other in family life and their local environment. Yes. But it wasn't always easy at the beginning. Sometimes it was really tough having those fights about no, and, you know, turning off things that just so that people just couldn't use them. So it's hopefully it's saying what is it that we want to do that's going to make us feel more connected and supported, and, you know, and take the positives that we can, sort of step back, look out and reflect on what do we want this time to give us. You know, how can we use this to our advantage, as well as just, oh my God, how are we going to deal with this next? Because I haven't got tech that works, I haven't got room, and I don't know what's coming. That's true, but there are definitely upsides to anything, and finding them and deciding to explore them and sit in them is the thing that's going to give us that capacity to break and be, you know, as in to have a break from the stress, and to find that resilience and that space and that quiet to be able to actually get positives out of the situation that we're in now as well.
I think that was a real mantra at end of last year, was that how do we build, and then I think we're all kind of just exhausted and surviving a lot of this year, but that mantra about build back better. How do we use the opportunity that everything is now being questioned and changing, to purposefully think about what do we do differently? How do we build back better? And there's a question from Jess about redefining success. And I think that's how do we think about what is it that, and for me too, so what is it important to be thinking about consideration for what is success, and how do you, and I think the real theme for me in listening and thinking about what you're talking about is creating an environment that enables that, even that conversation to happen.
Yes.
Because a lot of
think about, sorry,
no, keep going.
Is we build feedback loops all the time. So we get what we reward. So whether it's a country or as a family or as an organisation, we're rewarding what we're seeing in behaviour. And I guess I find it not the best here in terms of if you have one single driver, which is economic gain, say, which tends to be the overarching, certainly government sort of mantra here, and every single feedback loop in that system is geared towards that. And what you're seeing now is that means that the whole kind of I guess social capital structure part of which scaffolds a healthy society is just not, it's being ignored. And so we have to take that up. We have to do that. You know, you can't just have governments doing that anyway. So whether it's in families or in our institutes, in our work environments, we have to put that scaffolding back. And so we have to say, what is it that we want this system to look like, and what is it that we want to reward? And that goes right to that beautiful point of what does success look like. And in fact, that was the difference for me working in Finland and working in trust in adaptive societies. Looking at the difference between that single driver of something like economic gain and their question, which was their first question, was what does a successful society look like? And that meant the outcomes were looking at things like, you know, high quality education infrastructure, home life, health, aging, you know, those kind of things. And they're measured. Their quality of life in each of them is measured. And so turning wealth into well-being is their driver. And it's a very different, you know, whole system. So that doesn't mean we can't do those things here. It just means that that you take that on, we take it on much more locally.
Thank you very much. We will get some of the resources that Fiona has talked about throughout the session. As I said at the beginning, she has an incredible wealth of knowledge about things that will be very useful to be aware of. So we'll have it. We'll send out with the newsletter the recording. We'll also put in some resources that Fiona has mentioned, and we're really keen on your thoughts about how we could follow up with this at the beginning of next year. So any questions or responses you want to send through either in the chat or when we send out the newsletter. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll send out our final newsletter with a thank you for your engagement in WIDI's sessions, and we'll look forward to working with you all in 2022. Thanks.